So Tucker Carlson did a segment going after big corporations, specifically Walmart and Amazon and some others. This is really interesting for a number of reasons. Let's take a look and then we'll break it down.
Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, is worth about $150 billion. That's enough to make him the richest man in the world by far, and possibly the richest human being in all of human history. It's certainly enough to pay his employees well, but he doesn't. A huge number of Amazon workers are so poorly paid, they qualify for federal welfare benefits. According to data from the nonprofit group New Food Economy, nearly 1 in 3 Amazon employees in Arizona, for example, was on food stamps last year. Jeff Bezos isn't paying his workers enough to eat, so you made up the difference with your tax dollars. Next time you see Jeff Bezos, make certain that he says thank you. What about the Walton family? They founded Walmart. Collectively, they're worth about $175 billion. That's more than the entire gross domestic product of Qatar, the oil-rich Gulf state. The Waltons could certainly afford to be generous with their workers. Instead, they count on you to take up the slack. In 2013, taxpayers sent more than $6 billion to Walmart's employees for food stamps, Medicaid, and housing assistance. And if you think that's remarkable, meet Travis Kalanick. He's the youthful founder of Uber. His personal fortune is close to $5 billion. His drivers, by contrast, often make less than minimum wage. One recent study found that many Uber drivers lose money working for the company. That's not a sustainable business model. The only reason it continues is because of your generosity. Because you're paying the welfare benefits for Uber's impoverished drivers, child billionaires like Travis get to keep buying bigger houses and more airplanes. He's someone else who owes you a thank you note. If you can think of a less fair system than this, send us an email. We'd love to hear about it. This system is indefensible. And yet, almost nobody ever complains about it. How come? Well, conservatives like us support the free market, and for good reason. The free market works. But there's nothing free about this market. A lot of these companies operate as monopolies. They hate markets. They use government regulation to crush competition. There's nothing conservative about that, just as there's nothing conservative about most big corporations. Just the opposite. They are the backbone of the left.
Not so sure about that ending there. All right, so let's break it down. In parts, he's 100% correct, and in fact, he's pivoting to the left of many elected Democrats. But in parts, he's like that last part. He's trying to use this issue to pretend as if the right are on the side of working people and against these big CEOs. And that part is just empirically incorrect. In fact, if you look, both parties are corrupt and both parties are bought by corporations. But if you wanted to break it down as a percentage, it would be almost 100% of the Republican Party, bar formerly Ron Paul, who wasn't bought, and maybe Rand Paul today, who's like half bought. But virtually every other elected Republican is totally bought. So this idea of like, well, the right's here to save you from the corporations and the big bad left who's in bed with them, that's nonsense. Now, on the flip side, if the Republicans are 98% corrupt, the Democrats are maybe 80% corrupt. So there's 80% of the elected Democrats or corporate Democrats who are in bed with Wall Street. They are in bed with Big Pharma. They are in bed with the military-industrial complex, with all of the Republicans too, because they're also in bed with those actors. But Tucker, if you want to talk about which side has a movement right now that's trying to make it so that we elect politicians that represent the people, that would be the left. That would be Justice Democrats. That would be this populist left insurgency. One of the hallmarks of all of these candidates is they don't take corporate PAC money. Why? Because they don't want to be beholden to those corporations. They want to represent the people, so they're only raising in small dollar donations from regular people. Now, go ahead, Tucker, you point me to the movement on the right that's doing the same thing. You can't do it, because they're not doing it. So, again, in areas he's right, but in other areas he's doing a little sleight of hand trick there to try to make you think like, oh, and that's why you need to be for Republicans. No, they're even more guilty of the thing that you're railing against there. As if what? Republicans are not like vehemently on the side of billionaires and CEOs? Are you kidding me? So he mentions the free market there, and here's another important bait and switch he does. He's railing against all the billionaire CEOs, big bad billionaire CEOs. This is so wrong and bad. And then he says, well, you're supposed to be conservative. This is not conservative. Conservative is we believe in the free market. Now, he's right in that these corporations they're corporatist more than they believe in capitalism, because capitalism is actual competition. Corporatism is socialism for the rich. So it's the corporations buying the government and then trying to keep the status quo in place because they're the current beneficiaries of the status quo. So he's right about that, but he's wrong about, the solution to this rampant corporatism is capitalism, because, for example, if you were to move to a totally free market system, it's not like you would have these workers making a living wage. In fact, quite the opposite. They would be making shitty wages, and then there would also be no way to ameliorate that through a social safety net, because a pure free market capitalist system would be there is no social safety net to pick you up when the market is fucking you over. So if you move to a totally capitalist free market system, Tucker, in a system like that, and you know this very well, they would get rid of the minimum wage, for example. They'd get rid of child labor laws. They'd get rid of basic safety protections. That's a true free market. So for him to act like the solution to this rampant, corrupt corporatism, for him to act like the solution to that is free market capitalism, that's not true. In fact, that would exacerbate some of the same problems that he's describing under this rampant corporatist system. So that's another trick he's doing there. But putting all those points aside, he's right about Jeff Bezos. And remember, Bernie Sanders just introduced a bill on this, which is why Tucker Carlson is talking about it. And Bernie Sanders' bill says, you giant corporations make enough money to pay your workers a living wage, but you're not paying them a living wage. So here's what we're going to do. The government is going to tax you 100% for all of the money that taxpayers have to pay to make up the difference and pay your workers a living wage. So in other words, these workers don't make a living wage, and then they have to go to the social safety net to make enough money to survive. So what Bernie Sanders is saying is, no, for every dollar they get from the social safety net, where they're taking money from taxpayers, you, the corporation, are going to be taxed 100% for that. So in other words, that's a way to force them to pay a living wage. But the issue when you frame it like that is actually framed in a very bipartisan way. Why? Because when Democrats see that piece of legislation, they go, oh, okay, I'm in favor of paying these people a living wage, so I'm in favor of it. But even when Republicans see that piece of legislation, they say, oh, well, what Bernie's doing is actually shrinking government. Because he's saying the taxpayers shouldn't have to pick up the slack and pay for these people who are working full-time jobs. Those companies should just pay them enough so that they don't need to run to the taxpayers to get help. So that's why a guy like Tucker Carlson is now in a position where he's able to go out there and actually support this piece of legislation from Bernie Sanders because of the way Bernie framed it. This is something I've seen Ro Khanna do a few times as well. He takes a bill that's a left-wing idea that's very popular, but he frames it in a way where you can make the right wing understand, hey, you actually should be in favor of this too. Because ultimately what this bill does, even though it's to pay a living wage to workers, it also massively shrinks government because it gets people off of welfare. It gets people off of the social safety net, which costs taxpayers money. So you get to shrink the size of government as you force them to pay a living wage. So it's a brilliant idea. But be careful, guys, because what Tucker Carlson is doing here is he's taking an issue that is very popular nowadays because there's rampant income inequality and everybody understands how rigged and fucked up our economy is. It doesn't take that much research to figure it out. Like with Trump going around bragging, oh, the economy's tremendous, it's unbelievable, the workers are doing great. Utter nonsense, man, utter nonsense. You have wages are falling. Just because the unemployment rate is low, that's not a great indicator of how the economy's doing. So people know that things are fucked up. And what Tucker's doing, because Tucker is a much better propagandist than the other people on Fox News, is instead of going with the standard bullshit line, which is not convincing at all, the Laura Ingraham line, the Sean Hannity line, everything's great, it's tremendous. What he's doing is saying, oh, no, you're right, everything is fucked up. And it's fucked up because of these billionaires and because they're rigging the system and because they're forcing taxpayers to pick up the slack for their workers who they're refusing to pay a living wage. But let's be clear, the answer is unfettered capitalism. No. That last trick you did, that's a trick, And that's not the truth, because if you move to an unfettered capitalist system, these guys would be paid perhaps even less, and they wouldn't even be able to go to the social safety net to pick up the slack. So it's a brilliant segment on his part, and he's a much better propagandist than the other people on Fox News, and he has a younger audience, and you could see how he would appeal to a younger audience compared to the other dinosaurs on Fox. But ultimately, he's being a little weaselly here, because the solution he's selling is not a real solution. In fact, it would probably exacerbate the problem. But he's right for ripping Jeff Bezos. He's right for ripping the Waltons, because it is true that they should be paying a living wage, but the government should force them to pay a living wage through living wage laws. I like Bernie's legislation, but I think a better piece of legislation is just pass a living wage law. Not, we're going to tax you 100% for the people who, have to go to the social safety net. That's a roundabout way, and it's good framing for marketing's sake, but a better law would just be a living wage law. But just remember, if Bernie had proposed that law, and he has, by the way, $15 minimum wage, Tucker has not spoken up in favor of that law. Why? Because he doesn't get to frame it from his perspective of, this would shrink the government, and that would be good, and, But again, he acts like, the left are the ones who are typically more in bed with corporations. Dude, you're doing a segment where you're talking about Bernie Sanders' bill, which is going to have more Democratic sponsors than Republican sponsors. So I get what he's trying to do here, and he's trying to get people on the right to be more cognizant and aware of the fact that these billionaire oligarchs are exactly that, billionaire oligarchs, and they're not for you. So to an extent, it's respectable, but again, I just think the solutions that he wants are not real solutions, so you have to be a little bit careful here in breaking it down.